So for those of you who follow the political news closely, like I do, one interesting development recently has been Trump developing a kind of obsession with the 1890s and specifically President McKinley.
Our country was the richest relatively in the 1880s and 1890s. A president who was assassinated named McKinley. He was the Tariff king.
He seems to see a lot of parallels between McKinley and himself. He likes to note that McKinley was the victim of an assassination attempt and draws obviously comparisons with assassination attempts against himself, which, unlike those against McKinley, have not yet been successful. He also likes to talk a lot about the tariffs that McKinley imposed and which he would like to impose, which he argues is going to make America wealthier, make people's lives better, and he says that in the time of McKinley, in that 1890s, 1880s time period, that America was one of the wealthiest countries in the world, one of the wealthiest points in its history. And I think that this is fundamentally a very wrong and oversimplified view of an incredibly important era of U.S. history. And after hearing this, specifically his comments on the Joe Rogan podcast, which came out fairly recently, I thought it would be good to kind of go through them a little bit and talk about what the reality is for this time period and why I think it's important to understand it in a more honest way that doesn't kind of just ignore the reality of 1890s politics and the many flaws with McKinley's policies specifically. So with that being said, let's go ahead and run the intro and jump into this bonus episode.
It therefore seems to me most important that you, the people of the state of Illinois, should know your university. Is it doing what you want it to do as the people's university? You are the owners, and your decision is final. Learning and labor. For the people and by the people. The people's university.
All right, so before we get started diving into the parallels that Trump is drawing between the 1890s and the modern day, I do want to talk about a little bit about where I'm getting my perspective on this from, and specifically the fact that most of my research from the 1890s period is going to come from my previous episode, episode 2, which was a 2-part episode on the governor of Illinois, John Peter Altgeld, who was a political contemporary of William McKinley and was a figure in the Democratic Party at the time, while McKinley was in the Republican Party. So I'm not unequivocally an expert in this time period or anything like that. I mostly just have learned about it because of this research. And when I heard Trump talk about it, there was a million different connections that I made in my head that I kind of just wanted to flesh out and talk about with you all. And so that's why this is a bonus episode. It's kind of just a little bit more impromptu, going back to what I've already researched and thought about and connecting it to this kind of contemporary discussion. And I also just want to acknowledge that this is where my perspective and knowledge is coming from. So if people have different perspectives or critiques of what I'm saying, I'm happy to hear that, because I'm sure there's a lot more that I could learn about this time period and these policies. But I'm just coming at it from that perspective, mostly having read about Altgeld and the politics that he found himself in. And of course, that was, involved very much with the politics of the country as a whole and, McKinley's policies that Trump is citing here. And for me, I'm most sympathetic in this period to the more progressive elements of the time, right? There was certain progressive elements within the populist movement. There would be in the progressive era, which would really start to become identified later on in the early 20th century. And I view Altgeld as kind of a figure that kind of bridges the gap a little bit between these two eras, coming up in kind of the populist movement and rising to power in a large part because of the populist movement, but also pioneering a lot of the policies that would go on to define the progressive era in some ways. So that's where I'm coming from. And I think with that out of the way, we can go ahead and jump into some of the parallels that have been drawn here by Trump to the modern day. And I think the first one, which is a little bit less serious and political and economic, but it is the assassination attempts. And for those of you who don't know, President McKinley was assassinated by an anarchist. Generally, this period was a time in which there was a lot of fear of anarchists and radical left-wing people pushed by the media and the mainstream political establishment. And just like you see today, you had the Republican Party comparing the Democrats to these, alleged anarchist radicals or communist radicals, right? You had William McKinley calling the Democrats anarchists. You had Theodore Roosevelt comparing both Altgeld and the Democratic presidential candidate William Jennings Bryan to the radicals of the Paris Commune. And there's actually a quote from Theodore Roosevelt where he says we should, line Altgeld and William Jennings Bryan up against the wall and shoot them, which is pretty insane. And Theodore Roosevelt did, of course, run as the vice presidential candidate for McKinley in the subsequent election, 1900, when he was running for re-election. Those are the comparisons that I think are similar between the time period. The fact that there is this scaremongering about the radical and far left. And I mean, the difference is, of course, there isn't actually any real examples of far left violence against political figures that you can point to that are, certainly none as prominent as the assassination of the president. But nevertheless, the Republican Party continues to call the Democrats, communists or radicals or, whatever they come up with on any given day. But, in reality, it seems as though the people who have tried to assassinate Trump were relatively conservative or maybe, liberal, but not super radical left-wing people or anything like that. So there isn't really a super consistent element between either of these two cases. I think Trump just wants to paint it as, himself being an outsider against the system and saying that McKinley was also kind of this outsider against the system who, was taken down by the elites or whatever, which, whatever you want to say about the anarchist who assassinated McKinley, he was not, an elite person who was assassinating McKinley because, he went too far against the system, right? It was very much a different reason for assassinating him. And similarly with Trump, he is a member of the elite. He is a member of right now, the establishment of the Republican Party, is all in support of Trump. And I think that this outsider narrative is very flimsy. A great example of this, going back to the 1890s, is the fact that the election of McKinley was actually the very first U.S. election that had a massive spending discrepancy, and specifically McKinley was financed by wealthy businessmen, and they spent more money in that election than any previous presidential election, and it was kind of the first big money politics election. And McKinley was very much the president of the elite, and I would say, Trump is also very much a president of the elite, or at least elements of the elite. Obviously, there are plenty of wealthy people who do not like Trump and would prefer the Democratic Party to be in power, but Trump very much does represent the financial interests of many wealthy people. That's, you can see that from Elon Musk to Jeff Bezos, who recently pressured the Washington Post not to endorse Kamala Harris. That isn't to say that Kamala Harris is some, champion of the downtrodden. I think she is very much still a presidential candidate who is very willing to work with the wealthy and protect their financial interests. But I do think that Trump trying to paint himself as this outsider against, the system is very inaccurate, and this assassination parallel is, I think, a way of him trying to do that, and I don't think it makes a whole lot of sense when you actually look at both what's going on right now and the history he's comparing himself to.
To me, the most beautiful word, and I've said this for the last couple of weeks, is the word tariff. This country can become rich with the proper use of tariffs.
Did you just float out the idea of getting rid of income taxes and replacing it with tariffs?
Well, okay.
Were we serious about that?
Yeah, sure, but why not?
Okay, another important part of this whole narrative is that Trump claims that our country was the richest, the best it's ever been in the era of high tariffs and before the use of the income tax to collect most of the government's revenue. And this is definitely also just flatly kind of incorrect. The 1880s and 1890s, this kind of period before the turn of the century, was known as the Gilded Age. And the Gilded Age was characterized by extreme inequality. So yes, there were, a strata of very wealthy people, but they were a small minority. And the vast majority of people, whether they were urban workers or whether they were workers or farmers that, still made up a large portion of the population in rural areas, Many of them were not, financially incredibly well off the way that Trump is making it out to be. And this wasn't a period of widespread prosperity. It was a period where there was a great deal of prosperity for those at the very top of the economy and a lot of people who were really struggling. And nowhere could that be more clear than the labor struggles that happened in this period. Specifically, after the 1893 recession, there was a lot of strikes happening throughout the country and a lot of conflict between the workers and their bosses, very often with the government coming in and taking the side of the bosses. And this included McKinley. This included the Democrat before him, Grover Cleveland, who was kind of kicked out of the Democratic Party by Altgeld and William Jennings Bryan prior to the 1896 election, where the Democrats presented themselves as a more pro-worker, pro-farmer party and had a more, progressive left-wing platform. But what I really want to emphasize is that this was not a period of widespread prosperity. It was a period of extreme inequality. And there was also a very limited level of infrastructure for the federal government, from the security state, things like police and the military, to prisons, to just like social welfare programs that actually help people. So from the more harmful to the more positive elements of the government, there was a real limited level of government involvement at the federal level. And the government didn't have a whole lot of revenue to put into these programs, largely because the revenue was generated primarily with just this tariff revenue. And that wasn't a super, stable way of setting up an economy. So basically what Trump is advocating when he says to go back to the 1890s is he's advocating to go back to a period of extreme inequality where the federal government wasn't really involved in people's lives very heavily. And obviously there are, libertarians or people who might see the appeal of that, but in practice what that also meant is a lack of any real social welfare programs that helped people from the government as well, and just basic infrastructure that makes up our modern society. Like going back to the 1890s level of government would not really allow us to keep any of the modern conveniences that we now have and take for granted. So I think it is definitely a very silly point to make, and not surprising to see coming from Trump, but it is still worth talking about a little bit what the actual conditions were like in this period of time. The number one policy, of course, that Trump does emphasize the most is tariffs when he characterizes this period, right? And there is some truth to that idea that the tariffs were super important for the government at the time, generated a lot of money for the government at the time. I mean, they were essentially the main revenue generation for the country before income tax was implemented, right? That doesn't mean that they were this wonderful thing, though, that had no flaws, right? So to get into this a little bit, I want to just talk about like what is a tariff and what are the pros and cons of tariffs, and then kind of talk a little bit about how it happened in the 1880s and 90s and how tariffs might manifest today. So basically, a tariff is a tax on goods that are coming into the country, and usually it's on imports. And in practice, what this tax does is obviously it generates revenue from those imports coming in. But generally speaking, that will require the person or company importing a goods to raise the prices of the good to make up for the tariff, right? So this is generally the main criticism of tariffs, is that they are going to raise prices for people in the country that is imposing the tariff. The proposed benefit of the tariff is to strengthen domestic industry where it might be undercut by another country's industry. So, Trump talks about auto manufacturers in Michigan and says that with tariffs on Chinese cars, they'll be able to keep producing cars in the United States, and that purchasing them in the United States and keeping it in the domestic economy rather than having China produce these cars and selling them to the U.S. because it will be too expensive to sell them to the U.S. because they'll have to pay this, the consumer will have to pay this extra high price that is caused by the tariff. And I think generally tariffs are like very oversimplified. Trump is obviously making it sound like they're just an unmitigated good that is always going to benefit the domestic economy, which isn't really true. There are important consequences that can be negative for tariffs, especially when you're talking about the incredibly high numbers that he is. And they are going to, be harmful to the economy in some cases, especially if you're comparing it with something like eliminating the income tax, which we can get into a little bit more later, why that can be so harmful to people with lower incomes. But, there are historical periods of a lot of economic development for many countries where they did have high tariffs. So it's not like they have no history of, success, and including in the United States to some extent, but I think in a lot of other countries as well that have developed with this kind of protective view of their own domestic industry, right? There is like some truth to that. I think Trump vastly overstates it. But on the other hand, I do think that a lot of mainstream economics, at least how I was taught it when I went to school, they try to present like a balanced view of tariffs, but I think the conclusion almost always ends up being pretty anti-tariff because they want to look at this free market perspective where any intervention in the economy is kind of viewed negatively, and tariffs are kind of considered just one of the interventions. I personally think that you have to look at it very much on a case-by-case basis, look at the development of the country, what it's doing, look at also alternatives to tariffs for protecting jobs. Like, you can protect jobs without using tariffs. There's other ways to, empower workers to keep their jobs. And I think that, free trade policy doesn't just have to be about that one element of it. So I think it's a lot more complicated than that. And I think that, the main thing I want to get across with tariffs is that while they were a very important element of the 1890s economy, that wasn't necessarily a good thing. And it didn't necessarily allow for the government to do a whole lot with that money. It was just kind of the default status. And I think is actually a lot better to have income taxes, especially progressive income taxes, which is kind of the next thing I want to talk about.
And then around in the early 1900s, they switched over stupidly to, frankly, an income tax.
To go into that a little bit more, basically the reason why a progressive taxation system, which just means that as you go up the income level, you're taxed a higher percentage of your income. So someone who makes, $500,000 a year is going to be paying a higher proportion of their income in taxes than someone who makes, $50,000 a year, which I think, if you just look at it on its basic level, is a pretty fair way of looking at it, because a person who is making so much more money will have more to spare than someone who is making a lot less, generally speaking. So what tariffs do is, unless they are, selectively targeted to, luxury goods, for example, tariffs are generally going to be in practice, a sales tax that is paid much more predominantly by lower income people, which is true of pretty much any, consumption-based tax. That doesn't mean these taxes are always bad necessarily, but it is just the reality that when a larger proportion of your income is spent on your day-to-day consumption, which is the case for people who are lower income, you are going to be paying disproportionately more of the tax than someone who is wealthy, who, a lot of the money that they're making is not going to, whatever product might be tariffed, because they have so much more income to spend on other things or put into savings or investments or whatever. So basically, any sales tax, including tariffs, which are effectively going to be passed on to the consumer, are going to be, regressive in the sense that they're going to disproportionately be paid by people with lower incomes. Whereas income taxes are, very often designed intentionally to do the opposite. Now, because of how much tax evasion happens in the United States, in practice, this isn't always the case, but, at least in theory, income taxes are actually a lot more fair, in my opinion, and are a much better way of generating revenue for a government than tariffs alone, which I don't know if there's any government in the modern day that just generates all their money on tariffs like Trump is suggesting and got rid of an income tax. Perhaps there are examples that I'm not totally aware of, but I don't think it's a particularly realistic idea, and I don't think it would be a very fair way of generating revenue for the economy. So, that is the reason why so many people who were progressives in the 1890s, from Altgeld to the populist movement to the socialists of the period, advocated for the implementation of an income tax and advocated against tariffs. There's actually a passage where Altgeld, draws a metaphor comparing the Republican policies, including tariffs. And I guess I wanted to read a little bit of what he said, because I think he puts it better than me in terms of how the Republicans navigate these economic policies. And I think, honestly, you could say this exact same thing about how the Republicans communicate on economic issues today. So here's the quote. "The Republican Party has given the American laborer and the American farmer the kind of protection which the elephant gave to the partridges. When walking through the woods, the elephant ran across some partridges that had lost their mother and were in deep distress. His heart was moved with compassion. Tears rolled down his proboscis, and he said to them, "Come, get yourselves together now, and I will be a mother to you." They got themselves together, and he sat down upon them and covered them. So basically what Altgeld is saying here is that the Republican Party will make promises, will pretend to have empathy for the workers or farmers of this period, but in reality they're just going to crush them under their weight because they don't really care about them. So I think that that's kind of an accurate assessment of the economic policy of the Republicans in the 1890s and the economic policy of Republicans today. They will pretend that they are going to care about working people, but in reality their policies do not do so. And I think there's, many politicians across the spectrum who, pretend to help working people, but Republicans' economic policies are almost never going to actually really bring any kind of benefit to them.
Protection to labor and industry, preservation of the home market, and reciprocity which will extend our foreign market.
All right, so that's basically all I had to say on these policy issues that are brought up by Trump, where he draws these comparisons to President McKinley and tries to, paint himself as someone who can revitalize the economy and, bring us back to the good old days, which for now he's saying is the 1890s. But, this is really not an accurate understanding of history, of the economy of the 1890s, and is just another example of Trump, being a right-wing politician who cares about the interests of the wealthy, which I'm sure is not a surprise to, perhaps any of my listeners. But I did think it was at least interesting to go into that and talk about the reasons why this is so inaccurate, because this is a period of history that I think is personally super interesting, and I think is to some extent under-discussed in American culture. It's very interesting that Trump appears to be inspired by this part of history in this, reactionary way. And I actually think it's cool to be inspired by history, in general, but it's only really a cool thing when you're actually learning about, progressive and liberatory movements of the past, rather than looking at, the examples of people in power who were just really there to help the rich and powerful, which I think William McKinley is, certainly an example of. With that all in mind, with the election coming up, I definitely encourage people to vote their conscience. I know a lot of people who listen to this podcast are in Illinois, so the presidential vote doesn't really matter a whole lot, but I'm sure there's plenty of other things, no matter where you are, on the ballot. Whether it be ballot measures that change policies, or the rare instances where you do have an actual, progressive candidate running who is going to commit to change things and challenging the powers that be. I think that, it's important to do that, and it's important to gauge with the electoral aspect of politics, and that's why, this episode and the last one are kind of me attempting to do that a little bit more than I have done before on this podcast. So with that being said, thank you so much for listening to this. This is just kind of me rambling. It's something a little bit new and different, but this is a topic that I really just had a lot. I felt like I wanted to get out there about it, and I hope that those of you who listen to this bonus episode got something out of it, and I definitely enjoyed talking about it a little bit. So thank you all so much, and that's it for me today. Bye-bye.
Learning and labor. Station WILL has carried a special program this week giving information about the University of Illinois. If you have been a listener to these broadcasts, you have heard more or less about what the university does, how it does it, and what it hopes to do. Thank you, Dr. Willard.